Hello, hello, hello. We are back. This is Arts Respond, the first Arts Respond of September. We've taken a couple weeks off. And so let me tell you who's here. This is Arts Respond. I'm Lucy Gellman, although sometimes I don't remember my name. COVID time works like that. And I am joined by Daniel Fitzmaurice, who is not only my boss, but the executive director of the Arts Council of Greater New Haven, and Adrian Jefferson, who is the director of cultural affairs for the city of New Haven. So I'm really excited to be with these two wonderful humans on this bright and mostly sunny Friday. Happy Friday to both of you. Friday is a little arbitrary, but it still feels like Friday. So today we are talking about the arts and voting, and I will say in the past, 7 to 14 days, both of you have rolled out really sizable initiatives to not only make sure that artists are talking about voting, but to make sure that artists themselves are getting to the polls and that artists are helping other folks get to the polls. So let's jump right into this. Daniel, I'd like to start with you and talk about, so for folks who maybe haven't heard the 3 words, create the vote, which after, other 3 great 3-word phrases are maybe my favorite 3 words right now in the English language. For folks who haven't heard those words, what do they mean? And specifically in Connecticut, what is that initiative all about?
Yeah, well, you explained it, Lucy, which is great. I mean, it's basically like we have an election in this country and in the state of Connecticut and in your town every year, every November. And it is the Create the Vote campaign that we work on every year at the Arts Council and at the Connecticut Arts Alliance across the state, is to make sure that artists don't run to their studios or run away when it comes time to talk about that. And really just to give them, I mean, it's not the primary thing that an artist or a creative professional does, but it's something that everyone has to spend a little bit of time doing, right? Civic engagement can be made simple, can be made fun, can be made possible and accessible, and Create the Vote is trying to give folks the tools to do that effectively and honestly in the least amount of time possible. Nobody's got time to waste time. So how do we do that collectively? How do we do that in powerful ways? So we'll talk about what that means and what that looks like, but that's sort of like embodied in the whole idea of the campaign that we mount every year.
I was muted. It is just one of those days. And I do want to talk about what that means and what that looks like. But Adrian, I also want to ask you really quickly. So I know that your life is civic engagement. Your beat is sort of arts and civic engagement. But you just rolled something out this week. And I'm wondering if you can tell listeners about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we rolled out something called It's the Election for You. Which is really geared towards Black and Brown creatives activating their voting rights. We wanted to do something with a pop culture flair, and this actually has been in the works for a couple of months. We were deciding on what would be the best tactic to really do a campaign around the need, especially right now with everything that we're seeing, the need to get people to the polls. And we were exploring a few ideas with like PSAs and like social media campaigns. And it really came down to the point where we were like, you know what, we can do all of that, but let's have a meaningful conversation around voting. And particularly because a lot of people don't think voting is effective and really just don't trust the process, with voter suppression being like at an all-time high. You know, it's really difficult to get young people and young people of color to the polls because of the numbers that are showing when it comes to voter suppression. So we want to have a conversation around that and really talk about the change that can be created when you activate your right to vote. So this was the concept behind it is the election for you. And we got a really great lead speaker who's Mouse Jones, who is part of Charlemagne's camp, if you're familiar with Charlemagne the God. And also we got 2 homegrown New Haven natives who are young creatives.
Yes, and so I want to get into both of those initiatives, but first of all, for both of you, and like I know the answer, but listeners may not know the answer to this. why is it important to vote? Which sounds like a big duh, right? But I've been having those conversations in my circles, and I imagine both of you have too. But also for artists who maybe say to you, hey, that's not my thing. Or even artists who say, I'm going to keep it apolitical. What's the conversation like there?
Well, I know that for me, it's twofold. And I'm just going to talk personally because I don't like talking for everybody else. I'll talk personally. I think about my ancestors. I think about the people who have come before me who died for the right to vote, which essentially is our right anyways. It is our right. It is not a privilege to vote. It is our right to vote. The words of Stokely Carmichael. And so I totally believe that. And I know what was fought for us to get to the point to activate our right to vote. But even beyond that, I believe, especially when it comes to Black and Brown communities and looking at power and where we don't have power, we lack in power mostly in economics and in politics. And so when we're really talking about shifting this narrative and dismantling systems, we need to start to activate our right to vote and also to run, running for different positions, right? There's so much stuff you can run for so that we can start to see leadership that looks like us and that is representative of our values and who will push the values and morals that we believe and also stand behind some of the legislation we want to see passed. So that's why it's important. To me, that's where protesting meets voting meets change, right? And that's my insight on it. Although I know a lot of people, again, just don't trust the system and may disagree.
Yeah. And maybe to connect it to create the vote in a way, like one thing we're doing is we're inviting folks to take the pledge to create the vote. And that does start with voting, like commit to voting by November 3rd and helping turn out. But that's like, and I don't want to downplay the importance of that, but like by committing to vote, you're then in this pledge. And I think in my life, I feel the same way, pledge to connect with those candidates that you're going to be voting for. Right. So once I think someone mentally realizes they're going to be voting, it encourages them to think about what they're voting for and who they're voting for and have that conversation with them. And that just ripples into the last bullet point, which is to getting your whole community and your audience that you can reach, like everyone's sphere of influence, into talking about things that matter to you. If that's the arts, great. If it's about social justice, great. But like the whole engagement process hinges on that decision to take that time to vote. And honestly, we're making it easier for other people to vote. If you're already an active voter, what can you do to make that more possible for other people in your network?
So let's also get into the nitty gritty of those discussions, right? So we live in a state where maybe not everyone is happy with the politicians that are running, that are on the ballot that they can vote for. And maybe we live in a country where some folks say, I'm not that excited about this election. So when both of you just, in your personal lives and your professional lives are talking about what is on the ballot, not just for you as human beings, but also for the arts, which I will say is a multi-billion, not million, right, dollar sector, but also tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of artists have lost their jobs during the COVID-19 pandemic. And thousands of gig workers especially are out of work right now, and sort of navigating the horrible ABCs of federal unemployment and aid. So what are those conversations like when someone says, okay, but what's on the ballot? What's at stake in this election for me?
I have numbers. And they're so sad. But so I'll just say that,
I love numbers.
We're estimating.
I love numbers too.
Yeah, we're estimating for Connecticut. So there's so many ways to look at this, but to talk about just the nonprofits as one way, which is when we think about this election, right, which is for our local senators and reps who work in Hartford at the state capitol, they appropriate money to go to arts nonprofits. And right now we're saying that they've lost $386 million as a result of the pandemic. But also, and there's been amazing work that's work that we've done to figure that out, but also there's been national research done. The one that we're celebrating, if you will, or promoting is that the industry, the creative industry, right? And that's more broad. That's talking about recording arts, media, architecture, the broader term, has lost $2.4 billion in Connecticut. And that just ripples into our cities and towns. I mean, I think that's at stake. And I also want to, I guess, just as like a reminder, but also just the importance of thinking about the arts and its embeddedness in all of what might be important to folks in this upcoming election, right? So like if you're an artist, or if you're in the audience in the arts, or you're a student in the arts, or an arts professional, like how we think about the social healing and like what needs to come from coronavirus and the loss of life and the loss of livelihoods and employment, how we want to talk about segregation and social justice, like that all lives in this conversation about the arts as well. And so, I mean, I think it's, I mean, from that perspective, then like a lot is at stake. And maybe that's part of what this campaign is about, is like in order to create that connection so that it can feel about more than what might be a transactional investment in an arts organization, and think about it more broadly as like, how does the arts make Connecticut better? How does it make New Haven better? And how can we then bring that to our elected officials so they realize that it's a win-win proposition for the community and for them?
Yeah, and I think, first of all, that was nicely put, and I don't feel the need to be redundant. I think what's coming to my mind is mostly like just the power that artists have really to shape movements and to really activate change. So for me, it's more about, I don't really, I have my personal views on who I'm going to vote for, right? But I don't care who you vote for. The point is to activate your right to vote based on what's important to you. And I think that it's undeniable when artists, young people, and when culture shows up in the polls, the direction and the dynamic, it can change. We saw it with Barack Obama. They did, the hip hop world did an entire movement pushing votings to get Barack Obama in office. And it really took, it was interesting to me because it took embedding the culture community, the arts community, young people to even get the results of Barack Obama being in office. And so it shows that there's power in numbers, and that Black and brown people have power that they need to utilize in order to start to create change, and also in order to just activate the right that is theirs. So for me, it's more about the principle of voting. And this is usually, and honestly, Lucy, this is an ongoing conversation that we are having with, like some people just saying, like, to your point, why do I want to vote? I don't want to vote for anybody on this ballot. And I don't think any of them has a Black agenda. And I don't think, so these are the conversations that we're having. And there's not been an answer to it. There's just only opinions. And my opinion is that it's more important to activate your personal right to vote. And it's not necessarily always about the candidate, but about just your right. And that's what I've been focused on the most.
So Daniel, although Adrian, obviously this is open to you because among other things, you're someone who has worked with the State Office of the Arts. But Daniel, one of the things that Create the Vote does that I found really interesting when y'all were working on the gubernatorial election way back when in the before COVID land was a candidate questionnaire that challenges candidates to think critically about the arts. Has it been your own experience in asking folks these questions that there is not a critical interaction with the arts until folks are prompted to think about it?
Yes, and yes. But I'll also, and we're going to publish the first, whatever has been received from candidates by Tuesday, we're going to publish thereafter. So you'll begin to see some of this, but a lot of it, I do want to echo, some of this happens behind the scenes, like what we get in emails from candidates or in conversations with them. One is, I got this questionnaire from 3 different people. So that's why I took it. And I'm not joking about that number. 3 people sent me this, so I decided I wanted to take it. There are other folks who say, I'm not going to name them, but I get lots of these questionnaires. But my family, like, I love the arts. Like, we're really committed to it. And the way you worded these questions made me want to do it. And I'm sitting on other questionnaires that I'm going to wait to do by the deadline if I do it all. it's an invitation that people welcome. I'll also say, oftentimes people ask me like, well, what should I do? Like, okay, I'm going to commit to voting. Like, then what should I do? And the first question that we always use in this effort is about their personal connection to the arts. And I've actually experienced personally, and folks who were on my steering committee last year for Create the Vote New Haven experienced this personally. It sometimes actually is not answered by the candidate. And it is the critical question, right? And so we've had candidates say, we'll ask, what's your connection? Well, how do you personally experience the arts? What do you enjoy? How do you get creative? What does that look like? And they'll answer from like some policy perspective. And then we'll re-ask the question, like, no, but like you're a human and we're humans and we live in this community together. What places do you love? What things do you do? And their whole posture shifts. Like I've seen candidates like shoulders relax, their jaws relax, and they talk about the jewelry that they make, or they talk about the music they want to make, or the places they love taking their kids and families. And like that's, I mean, people who are politicians are people. and to remind ourselves of that through something like the arts is it's a really big part of that, because then the rest of it flows easy. The rest of it just is then ongoing conversation about how we could amplify the power of the arts.
And I will say, Adrian, I want you to hop in, but I would just be remiss if I did not mention that in Connecticut, we currently have a governor who quotes Hamilton frequently, although he quotes Aaron Burr from the musical. Make of that what you may.
Aaron Burr is my favorite character in Hamilton.
Leslie Odom Jr. has done a great service to, I think, to actually exposing how complicated and complex Aaron Burr was, which is a whole other episode. But I've been with the governor when he talks about being in the room where it happens. And it's, but Daniel, you're right, which is just to say the arts does touch everything. Adrian, you were nodding very avidly, so I want you to hop in.
Oh, I just agree. I mean, really, I just agree with what he's saying. I don't have that same type of experience with Daniel actually working directly with candidates who are running and then asking them, questions about the arts. When I was at the state, my position was more so being able to allocate funding and also being able to, I feel like, do work that will help to support the advocacy of why we need further funding, and then making sure that like candidates are aligned with that would be like the job of Daniel and the CAA. so I just agree. I actually don't really have too much comment on that.
Well, I thought we'd get here, Adrian. So here we are. Don't flash. But I just want to like acknowledge also so we've done Create the Vote several years in Connecticut. It was Massachusetts' idea first, but it's also like no one's idea. It's grassroots organizing. Like it is something that has been tried and true in communities for a long time. And in the arts, we're catching up with other industries that think this way and work this way. But also like as you as an artist develop a relationship with your elected officials, as candidates especially, right? This is this key moment. You have this window before they begin to make decisions. Then the next step emerges, right? And I'll say, in 2019, when we did this with the mayoral election in New Haven, like the window opened for artists to be at the table for those transition conversations. That's when conversations about, and again, who you engage at this time is so critical, right? And who shows up for these types of things is so critical. Mm-hmm. So that's where engaging Black and Brown folks into this work now is vital, because then it's a slippery slope if you don't. So, that table included conversations about a cultural equity plan, and that being the key yearning, and bringing that to the now mayor, bringing that to you, Adrian, all of this it starts in this moment. So again, as we build this muscle as a community, as an arts sector, every fall, we've got to jump with 2 feet into this to begin to continue to keep making progress. I would say there's always some progress, but progress that's rooted in artists, especially who are not tend to be centered in these political choices.
I agree. And I would add also being very cognizant and aware of who governs, and being able to actually bring artists into that governance, right? And having these seats at the table. I think that's something And thank you, Daniel, for bringing up the cultural equity plan, because it's so relevant, because I think that's something that we heard very, very clearly, right? Through Mayor Elliker's transition report, which essentially came like once, it was determined that he was going to be in that role. And we heard from people very, very clearly that they want to talk about how artists can be more embedded in government. Obviously, from that perspective, they were talking about local government, but that applies to all forms of government. And how do we create these spaces and essentially being able to work with artists to help us through difficult situations, like the race conversation, right? Racial justice, anti-racism conversations with artists, and the way artists can direct those conversations are very different when we don't have them at the table. So I think when we're talking about voting and activating your right, all of this is tied to civic engagement and being able to actually use your voice to implement change.
Yeah, and Adrienne, I want to get into the specifics of that in New Haven, because I think right now there's a very specific moment that is partly led by the fact that this year, and I think especially this summer, has laid bare the parallel pandemics of COVID-19 and structural racism and white supremacy in the city. But artists are not the only ones responding, but artists are responding in force. And so how does this push to engage with voters, and specifically Black and Brown voters, sort of fit into the greater narrative of what's happening in New Haven right now?
Daniel, you have?
Nope. Talk about something else.
He said talk about something else. Well, I will say this. What we're seeing, and I really like the way Quadro, the artist who's actually been the one who was selected for the Black Lives Matter street art that's going to be happening on Bassett Street in Watson, and doing that in partnership with the Black Lives Matter movement. He said this very eloquently in his post on Instagram yesterday about this renaissance of artwork that we're seeing coming out of essentially the COVID-19, but really out of what we've been seeing with police brutality and racial injustice, and the need for anti-racism, and people being very in the anti-racist movement and not veering away from it. And so I think what we're seeing is exactly that. It's just this renaissance of activism that we're seeing in all different forms, arts included, and people really wanting to utilize their voice. Now, what I don't think, so actually contradictory to what you're saying, I actually don't think that often translates into voting, which is why we need to have initiatives that also addresses the importance of voting and how all of this connects. Because I actually think one of the biggest misses is the fact that, again, and I think protesting is great. I think anything that we can do to activate change and really light fire and put pressure on the top to create the needed change is necessary. But I also think it just never translates to the polls, and it often doesn't. So we need to be able to see the connection between all of these different things and realize that they're very much the same when we're talking about creating real systemic change. And so I actually just think it's the opposite of what you said.
I want to talk about the specifics of next week's event. Actually, there are two events. So on the 17th, there is this event that we've been talking about. And then on the 19th, with rain date the 20th, there is a full painting day in New Hallville. But I first want to talk about this event. But Daniel, I saw you chomping at the bit. So I just don't want to. Oh, okay.
I'm not chomping at the bit. I think what I realized in what you're saying, Adrienne, and it's like, I literally just realized it's 9/11 when you were talking, Adrienne.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to like mention that. And also what you made me think, Adrienne, is that like they're like something I yearn for, right? Is like, lots of people are going to vote for the presidential ticket. Fewer people are going to vote for their local tickets. And then even fewer people are going to stay engaged with those candidates to hold them accountable to their needs. And that's like things like, and like what we need to do, like what we need to do, like as we did after 9/11, the decisions that people make are, it's a very similar, like heavy situation that candidates or politicians are going to be in. And so I just think that I just thought about that as like you were talking, and like where that's like that engagement now is so critical. That starts with voting and moves to activism. So that and that's true in all our cities and towns. It doesn't, irregardless, all of our towns have to deal with how we heal and respond and create justice from this pandemic.
And I'm just seeing that we got a question. Actually, thank you, whoever asked the question. We never get questions. I appreciate.
Where do we get the question? Are we are we on like Facebook right now or something?
We're on Facebook. Okay. Harry Droz he's the man behind the magical radio curtain, and he's just making everything work. So thank you, Harry. But the question is, do you feel that the ability of local arts organizations to engage politically is overly limited by the tax code's restrictions on political and issue-based lobbying by nonprofits?
Oh boy. Well, I think this is what I think. From my awareness from working in the state, most organizations veer away from any type of political anything. They don't even want to get in, and it doesn't really answer this question directly because I actually don't know the answer to that question, but I just know that most do not want to engage politically. And actually, depending on what type of nonprofit you are, there's restrictions sometimes in your ordinance where you can't even engage in anything political or accept any type of political money. Like it's two separate things. But I'm sure Daniel has.
Yeah, I have a big fat no. There's so much that a nonprofit can do. And I just want to offer, like, in comparison, like other industries, ask the opposite question, right? How much can we spend on lobbying? How much time can we focus on the political machine that keeps us afloat? So without getting too wonky about it, like there is a technical threshold for what nonprofits can do. Of course, nonprofits cannot endorse candidates. Nonprofits, but also the emphasis I want to make is that it's about the amount of time your staff spends doing this effort. So it takes 1 minute to make an email and send it to a candidate. That's all, like maybe 2 minutes, right? That's a very limited amount of time. So even if you're emailing your candidate for something that qualifies as lobbying, that amount of time, it takes a lot to activate. But again, the focus of Create the Vote is on the grassroots engagement, not on the grass tops who are on the payroll in these nonprofits, right? Like the critical piece is, and volunteer time, your audiences or your artists who are on, and not on your payroll, but you work with all the time, like their effort is completely nonpartisan, wouldn't be part of any of your lobbying effort. So yeah, and again, I think we just it is a tendency, as we've seen in the national conversation, right, to politicize things that are not political, like people's lives, especially Black and Brown lives. So and it's important that arts organizations do their due diligence to make sure they're doing it properly, but it is critical that they do it. That's the critical piece, actually.
And can I add something that I feel is linked? And I was thinking this when you were talking earlier, Daniel, and it just came back to me. It's funny because Daniel and I actually had a brief conversation earlier about the decolonization of arts organizations, right? And we have a lot of people releasing solidarity statements, saying that they would like to be anti-racist and all of this. And now that needs to be put into practice. But why that's relevant when it comes to voting and it comes to like who you're supporting is who aligns to anti-racist practices or not. If you say as an organization, you now want to decolonize and become anti-racist, right? So that's just on my mind, obviously a little off of the question, but just, I think that that's something that I would inspire and encourage organizations to think about and people to think about in general when we're just talking about alignment with values and how we engage civically and what we support versus what we don't support.
Yeah. Well, and there's so many things also that are completely like wouldn't even be touching the line of lobbying that are critical for civic engagement, right? Like taking the day off so that everybody on your staff can vote is lobbying. creating opportunities.
That's true.
Even in communication with the artists or audiences you work with, right? Just encouraging that type of engagement is, that's a vital step in the process. So, and imagine if that, I mean, we will get that coming into November, but let's watch how many you get from nonprofit arts organizations in this region that say, as a reminder, you need to get your ballot in by this time, especially in this confusing year where there's mail-in voting and in-person voting and different deadlines and problems with the Postal Service. Like, I would love to see every arts organization in this region make time on their email and social media to put that out there to their audiences. So there's no question in our region about where to vote and when to vote by.
And I would be remiss if I also didn't mention that the U.S. Census Bureau has moved back the census collection deadline to September 30th. Mailed-in responses will be accepted until October 7th, but that is also part of civic engagement. Well, while we're on the subject, and Adrienne, I actually don't think it's off topic at all. So now that we've gone there, do cultural institutions and organizations have a civic obligation to their public or publics to engage with their own internalized white supremacy, whether or not it may be an election year? So I'm not specifically talking about sending out an email saying, hey, get your butt to the polls. Although I think the more people who can spread that message, the better for all Americans. I'm also talking about if an institution has a copy of Eli Whitney's Cotton Gin, talking about what that meant for the continuation of American slavery and the enslavement of Black people in the United States and the lives that it ended, however indirect that connection is for them.
Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. They have an accountability, but unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't see that, and so that's the problem. I feel like the accountability is more evident, and people click with it more once they realize that they want to really intentionally become anti-racist. And I think that so to me, it's without a doubt no-brainer that is exactly what organizations should be doing, especially the larger organizations that have such an impact, right? They're models, like they really have an influence on community. They have an influence on other smaller organizations, so I just feel like that is very, very important. But I just think that at the same time, we have to acknowledge that a lot of organizations are not there to even have that conversation you're talking about right now, Lucy. But I'm sure Daniel has so much to add.
Well, we just talked about it, but I earlier, but I think, I'll speak from the I more than about others, but I mean, I don't like history. It does not interest me. And I also know that like erasure is part of white supremacy culture. And so I don't know how to trace my roots in that, but personally, and again, because I don't like history, it doesn't interest me. But in our commitment at the Arts Council to anti-racism, I'm very interested in uncovering, our connection and our deep connection to urban renewal, and what is our role there, and just the further story of our industry. So, and all of our institutions have that, like we can welcome that criticism and that accountability from ourselves rather than shy away from it. And it's just something I love exploring that part of our history because it illuminates the present. And I hope it is part of, I see patterns from the past at the Arts Council 50 years ago that are still alive today. And I can't break them until I really until I can see them. And then I can name that as something we need to do differently moving forward.
Right. But I always think, right, so it's so easy. History, I agree. I think it takes a lot. You have to be very intentional to deep dive into history. I think, though, it's easier to just look at policies, procedures, and protocol, whether it's on paper or not. They're just systems that happen, and be able to identify what those are and break those down and dismantle those. And I think that should be a part of what cultural institutions, especially those today, right, 2020, are doing. And Daniel and I, again, we speak all the time. And I think about this. I think about beyond the fact that we just all believe that this is like the three of us, we're all in cahoots. We're like, this is what needs to be done. It's a no-brainer. Besides that, I always think about the people who still just don't get it and that are running these major organizations that are primarily white-led, and white employed, all of that. And I think about sustainability and where people will or will not be by 2044 when that minority majority flips. And it actually becomes a matter of sustainability. So it's like if you don't get anything else we're talking about, just getting organizations to understand the importance of being able to now start to decolonize, to look at their policies and procedures and dismantle those, to become anti-racist, and also to think about how we're engaging new audience, which is going to look very different in 2044. That's where I really am trying to push, on the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
Also, can I to somehow like loop it in? Actually, you made me think, Adrian. Like, so much of art and advocacy in our history in Connecticut has been very special interest, and that's also very much bound up in race. And again, this effort that you're doing and through Create the Vote is not about that, right? It's not about transactional gain for one institution, your institution, or for your own artist fellowship program or what have you. It's about like being perceived as a powerful sector, as like a powerful community that has influence that's collective. And that's sustainable, right? Like that unit is sustainable in the long run more than the transaction of a grant.
Mm.
Yeah, and I will say, I believe we are the only state left, Daniel, that also uses the line item funding model to fund
I wish we
arts.
were.
Oh gosh, here we go.
We're not the only state left. But we are alone in terms of how our arts funding structures in Connecticut are complicated and not. But to name something that's also just inherent in the way that Connecticut works, as folks know, we also don't have county structures in Connecticut either. So, all of the resources that goes to cultural nonprofits or to individual artists through public funding, like my tax dollars, they can only flow through the state. And I don't want to discredit what cities and towns are doing for the arts, especially when Adrian's on the call. But like the cities and towns actually invest a lot in the arts. You just have to talk to them about what that looks like when you think about, farmers markets, concerts on the green. There's public school funding. More public school funding goes to the arts than money through the Office of the Arts going to the arts, right? So if we think about it in the broadest sense, that's true, but we are always kind of crippling ourselves because we don't have counties that tend to, in other states, invest big money in local and regional art initiatives.
So I want to ask Adrian about It's the Election for Me. So on Thursday night, September 17th, can you give us a sneak peek of what we might be seeing and experiencing and listening to?
Yeah, of course. So it's actually on September 16th.
I am so sorry.
It's totally okay. And I'm like, unless I have the date wrong, let me look. There's so much happening next week. So
there is, yeah.
There's a lot happening. But September 16th, 7 p.m., we are going to be on Zoom. And it's really just going to be an open forum type conversation with Mouse Jones, who I mentioned earlier, moderating the conversation around voting. Now, this conversation is going to be very specific to young people of color, young Black and brown BIPOC people, and just talking about the pros and what they may feel are the cons to voting, and what why they're scared, why they're hesitant, and then kind of talking more about the benefits of voting. And so be really open-ended with some other guest speakers who have also grappled in their own way with whether they're going to vote or not, or why it's voting and why voting is important. And essentially has come down to them that they are going to be voting and it is important. So we want to hear those testimonies on why, and kind of like what awoke that in them to be able to now want to support voting, and not just support voting, but using their own influence and power to get other creatives and other people, other peers to vote as well. So that's what it is. It's a forum, an open kind of panel conversation that's then open in like a town hall type setting. Should be very cool.
And Adrian, I before we run out of time, I mean, I could talk to you for like 3 hours I don't know if listeners would enjoy that as much as I would enjoy that. But I want to talk about how this ties into something you've been working on for a number of months and something we've written on a bit in the arts paper, which is the city's cultural equity plan. So New Haven has never had a cultural equity plan. When people hear those words, which are magic words, not unlike create the vote, they might not know what it means. Can you talk just a little bit about where we are with that and what it means for a city to have a cultural equity plan?
It means everything for a city to have a cultural equity plan. And I hope that we've seen that since everything that's happened since March. So I think it goes without saying that if, I keep saying, I feel like if we had a cultural equity plan already in place, perhaps we would have been more prepared for a lot of the crises that we've seen come in the arts community and the exacerbation in the Black and Brown communities in particular. But as far as the cultural equity plan, it's really interesting because it seems as if we've done some things in reverse. Because of everything that's happened since March, we've found the need to really be more responsive than waiting for strategy. We really needed to, of course, we partnered with you guys, the Arts Council, for the Creative Relief Fund. We're doing this renaissance, as Quadro would say, of Black Lives Matter art all across the city and looking at public art in an anti-racist purview. We've done and we've rolled out this new Arts for Anti-Racism pledge for arts organizations to begin the work towards being anti-racist, right? So we're doing all of these things that actually were already in discussion as being a part of the things that are a priority for us as we're embedding on this plan. We've said it's important for us to not only engage with the community, but to make sure we're not just doing for, but with. And we are able to now do that through these many different projects that we're working on because of the fact that we needed to respond and really be intentional about how we are serving people right now, and knowing that we can't wait for a plan that's going to be done in 10 months or longer or maybe shorter. We need to do it now. So that's been the difference. It's almost like we've already started the actual plan. We've already started the framework for it. And now we're actually going to go into getting it on paper, getting the strategy, and being more intentional and surveying what's working, what's not, what else needs to be created. So that's where we are in the process. And Daniel can chime in because we're partnering, of course, with the Arts Council on this. Which I think is great.
Right. I think that's right. And I think just like a part of that reflection is also like nationally, there are a lot of cultural plans. And what happens sometimes is that like they are these big, expensive, long processes that sit on the shelf. And we've also seen in the research that when they actually do engage the community in a deep and meaningful way, equity becomes the resounding request. And so a lot of these plans don't start out as an equity plan, but they have to figure out how to become one. And even more so, a lot of these plans just sit and they don't go anywhere. And so far we've counteracted all of that, Adrian. It is. I don't want to make light of the pandemic, but it is the urgency has created a lot of opportunity to demonstrate that, like on the ground, 2 feet planted.
Yeah, the importance. No, that's absolutely right. The importance of this type of plan. I think the difference is you'll hear cultural plan and then you'll hear cultural equity plan. And the difference is that equity really makes you look at the most marginalized groups who are not being served through the arts and to the biggest capacity that they can be, that, have issues of mobility, transportation, health, food justice. It makes you really think about how we are centering Black and Brown lives, right? Not saying that we're not going to serve everyone in the arts. We already know that, right? But we need to be intentional about those who are continually left out. And that is the difference between a cultural plan that really is just talking about arts in the city and, probably going to focus on downtown mostly, versus how do we disrupt this, focus on the neighborhoods, and focus on putting people first who are always left behind in most situations.
So if I'm listening to this, or I'm an artist, and I want to know what my next 5 action steps should be, what are they? Like, give me the rundown.
Make a plan to vote.
Are you asking me or Daniel?
We're going to make it together.
Both of you.
5 action. Okay. Are we talking about voting?
Yeah.
Or are we talking talking about? What are we talking about?
So voting and also civic engagement. I thought I was muted, so I was like yelling extra loudly. Voting and civic engagement, and just like, yes, making a plan to, one, we've talked about it just a little bit, have the census by September 30th, because that determines, among other things, how much money comes to New Haven. And part of that is how much money will come to the arts in New Haven, but it also protects things like early childhood education and really important food assistance programs that were integral before COVID-19, but both food insecurity and unemployment we've seen skyrocket in the city and nationally during COVID-19. So, but also making a plan to get my butt to the polls either on November 3rd or to fill my absentee ballot out. What are my 5 steps for civic engagement?
Well, you just kind of said 2. So I would say getting the census turned in and making sure that you're registered to vote. I would also say, and of course, Daniel, I'll leave the last 2 to you. But I would also say getting to know like local government officials. And a good way to do that is through the democracy school that they have. And I'm not sure, this is kind of Omina's thing, so I don't want to overspeak on like dates and times. I know that they have one now that's in session, and I don't know how many they're doing, but something like that really allows you to get to know more about local government, how it operates in the department, which I think is very important, because education really is the gateway to being able to understand more about what you're voting for when it does come time to vote, and how government operates, at least on a local level. So those would be the first few that come to my mind.
Oh, and go to the events that your office is organizing.
Oh yeah, do that.
I'll just, I mean, if folks want to take the pledge to create the vote so they can get that like weekly reminder, like, oh, right, I have 5 minutes. I could do a micro action to commit to this project. You could just go to ctartsalliance.org. I also want to, I think the local election is more important than anything else, but the campaign called Be an Arts Hero is also really inspiring on the national level. And I think it's a similar model to Create the Vote. So if you see hashtag Create the Vote CT, that's awesome. And I think if you see the hashtag Arts Hero, that's also a great campaign to check out, and reach out to your national senators and representatives and let them know you're here and your voice matters.
And Adrienne, you mentioned Omina McCoy, who is at the City of New Haven. Folks can reach out to her. Also, if people are listening and they say, hey, I didn't even know we had a Department of Arts, Culture, and Tourism. How cool is that? How can they find out more about you, the work you do, and the work the department's doing?
To be honest, the easiest way to reach me personally is on my Instagram, which is Adrienne V. Jefferson. It's just the easiest way. Of course, if you want to learn more about just the department and get a quick snapshot, you can visit our Department of Cultural Affairs website, which is, once you go to the homepage on the city site, you'd be able to navigate from there. And also we have a page on our Together New Haven website, so togethernewhaven.com, which also has an arts and culture page and contact information. So, I'm very accessible. You can find me. I'm also on Facebook. So those who are viewing on Facebook, you can just go send me a friend request. I'll accept it.
And Daniel, I want to ask you the same question. So hopefully people know what the Arts Council is, because otherwise both of us are in hot water.
They definitely know. People know.
But also if people say, hey, I've never heard of this CAA thing, what is it? How can they find it, and how can they pledge to create the vote?
Yep, ctartsalliance.org. And it's a simple form. We just really want to know, we do want to know your zip code, because we're trying to keep track of where voters are participating and what that looks like for candidates. But yeah, you're signing up to get a weekly reminder every week about I keep calling them micro actions, right? We're boiling it down. This week's micro action was to find your house candidates and email them. So breaking it down into steps that feel like they can be done in 5 minutes a week, 10 minutes a week. I know time is valuable, but I think we could all commit that. And I would love for folks to be involved. And then there will be some continuing work after the point of the election as we look at the legislative session in January. And, that's going to be fun. Right, Lucy?
Oh, so much fun. So much fun. Well, I want to thank both of you. And as Daniel brought up, of course, on this anniversary of September 11th, the call to be civically engaged and be paying attention, I know certainly to me feels very, very powerful. So thank you both for your time. And I'm sure I will be seeing you either on the internets or in real life soon.
Thanks, Lucy.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Lucy.
you.
Bye.
Bye.